Hi everyone and welcome to episode 88 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Well, cost of living is still very much top of the agenda. We're seeing a lot more discussions around inflation still, although it does appear to be coming somewhat under control. Building costs are still very high, and property owners are probably fairly wary at the moment, and certainly those that are looking to purchase of having to take on projects and whether or not it's something that they really want to do in the present time. But for most property owners, they're always looking at ways to add value to their property and things that they could do, whether it is to a home or whether it is to an investment property. So today I thought I'd have a look at some of the more major additions that people make and how that translates into adding value. So I'm not talking about so much painting, carpet, window furnishings, that sort of thing. I'm more talking about significant additions. So things like, say, adding swimming pools, those sorts of things, what the cost of those is and whether or not it's justified from purely from an adding value perspective. And we'll look at it both from an investment and from an owner-occupier point of view. So starting with the first probably major one and something that a lot of people do grapple with and have discussions around, and that's certainly a swimming pool. Now, it's certainly not something that you would do from an investment properties perspective, and taking even out of the equation the cost of constructing a pool, the ongoing maintenance is quite significant, and it's really not something that you could or should expect a tenant to do, particularly if you want it to stay nice and clean and blue. Tenants don't typically, as they won't know how to look after a pool. So if you were going to, or if you did buy a property that's got something like that, it's probably advisable to have someone and factor it into the costings, but have someone come around and maintain that for the tenant so that they don't have to. So, as I said, it is more something that's looked at from a home perspective, and they are quite expensive, as anyone who's put one in will tell you. Typically, you can break down the installation of a pool into two parts. There's obviously the pool itself, and that usually you can look at either a concrete lined pool that's usually then tiled, or perhaps a fiberglass, and then there's obviously the filter system that needs to go in. And then if you do decide to add some form of heating, that will be an added cost as well. So whether that's solar heating or an electric pump or gas heating as well. So these are things that you need to factor in. Now the second part is the landscaping side of things, and that typically includes obviously the fencing, but then any paving around the outside, and then obviously gardens and things that will most likely need to be done too. And if you do speak to anyone that's installed a pool before, most of them will tell you that the landscaping side of things can be as expensive, and in some instances even more so than the pool itself. So it is something that needs to be considered. So you can get pools in certain areas, and if all circumstances are right, on a budget for around sort of 50, maybe even up to 100,000. But in a lot of instances, they're going to be in excess of 250 to 300,000, particularly if it is the concrete side, and then if you're doing some fairly elaborate landscaping around that, which people quite often want to do. So it's a significant expense, and it's something that you need to think about fairly seriously, given that, particularly in Melbourne, at best, you'll probably get 5, maybe 5.5 months of the year where you'll actually be able to use the pool. So the query then becomes, is it worth it, and should it be something that you do? Now, for a long time, and I've spoken about this before with real estate agents and in other podcasts, I've always felt that the cost of a pool is certainly greater than what the value that it will add to your property. But we've had a couple of discussions. Stuart Evans, in more recent episodes, was one of those who's a real estate agent around Burundara. And we spoke about the fact that gap has probably started to narrow in recent times. And I think that's come off the back of the pandemic, where there was a lot of focus on homes and people taking pride in them, but obviously spending more time in them and wanting to make sure that they had something that was user-friendly and that they could be proud of. And so I felt, I still do feel that the margin has narrowed. I still think that the cost is higher than the value add, but I definitely think that the gap there is much narrower than what it's been in the past. Now, if you go up to and speak to someone up in Queensland, they'll tell you that whatever it costs, it probably adds at least that, if not more so, because it becomes an expectation. But it's something in Melbourne that it's probably still a bit of a gap there. The next one is to have a look at is a granny flat or perhaps a studio, and whether or not that is something that that you would want to install. Now, again, it's probably more something that you would do from an owner-occupier's perspective rather than for an investment property. And you typically find that there'll be differing motivations for people for these constructions. Quite often it's because there might be a family member that's either looking at moving out and parents might be trying to hold them in, or it might be that you've got elderly parents and therefore need to have some form of flat because it's easier to have them living close by, and if they're on the same property, it's easy to support and help in that regard. The other alternative is that it's not just for a self-contained flat. It might be that you need extra accommodation. So another living zone, or it might be as part of a swimming pool, you might be putting in a pool room, that sort of thing to entertain from as well. And sometimes it can be easier to construct something totally separate in the backyard than it is to actually make an addition to the existing home, given what a floor plan might look like. And to add that living room, it won't flow as well if you're adding it onto the house. So putting a separate room out the back might be a better option. So, and for some people too, it may be that separation is really important, so that if it is a granny flat, having their own space and independence is important. Or if it is a pool room, you don't necessarily want it attached to the house. It's a separate entertaining area. So sometimes it is better to be totally separate. But one of the key aspects is with this space is having the space to be able to install it. And is the backyard going to be big enough? So if we look at an example, for a standard middle ring type suburb of Melbourne, you might have a block size of around 700 square metres. And the addition of a granny flat is going to take up a significant portion of that backyard if you've got a reasonable size home that's already in existence. Now, for the right buyer from a resale perspective, having that flat could be highly sought after and certainly add significant value. But what we tend to find is that the majority of buyers that are looking to purchase in those areas, the reason is that they want to have some form of backyard and outdoor space for a family. So taking up a large portion of that with a granny flat might limit the buyer profiles and limit the marketability of that type of property. Now, if you look at it more from a studio perspective, or that single room perhaps with a bathroom, so that it's got a bit more multi-purpose and a bit more multi-function to it, then that's a different story. And there's certainly opportunities to add just as much in terms of what it would cost in terms of value to the end property, because you do have that multifaceted use of the property. You could use it for a rumpus room for children. You could use it for a pool room for entertaining. You could use it for a work from home space as well. So there's having those different options and incorporating in as many more buyers from a resale perspective means that it's going to be a more suitable option. So I tend to think that with these, the granny flat is going to be a for purpose. You're going to do that because it's what you want, not necessarily to add value. It will add value, just not perhaps what it costs. Whereas the studio, that type of thing, if it's done in the right manner, it is incorporated well within the backyard and it's architecturally designed and fits really well, then it can certainly add what it costs and perhaps even more so. The next one is a garage. Now, I think personally that this has probably got the greatest potential to add value versus the cost of what it does. Now, again, it's very much dependent on the type of home we've got and what we're looking at in terms of a location. But if you're able to not only add a garage or a carport, but actually add car parking to a property that perhaps didn't have it beforehand, then and in the right location, that's going to add significant value to that property. And there's certainly ways and suburbs where you'll get a greater premium. So if we look at, say, as a starting point in Melbourne, an area like Middle Park or Albert Park, now there is a large majority of properties in there are single-fronted cottages or terrace homes. And parking is highly valuable and highly desired in those areas. So if you're able to create parking most likely off a rear laneway, and it's got a good rear laneway that perhaps wasn't there in the past, and perhaps put up a carport because the backyard allows it, or even a garage if it's really spacious, then that can add significant value. There's a large portion of high income earners in those two suburbs, and they highly value off-street parking. So if you're able to create that, then there'll certainly be premiums paid. Now, if we go to a different area and look perhaps at a middle ring type suburb, off-street car parking there becomes more of an expectation, and most properties there will have a driveway of some sort. The query then is what it leads to, and if it is just a driveway to pull cars in off the street, that's good, but it's more the norm than the adding value. If you can then add the undercover car parking, so in the form of a carport or a garage, then that's when you start to add value. Now, the costs obviously are more significant for a garage than for a carport, but it also gives security too. So I think in those scenarios where you can actually add something significant to a property that is highly desirable, in a lot of instances, you'll be able to add more value than the cost will be there, which is certainly something to be considered in the right spot. Now, the final one that I wanted to look at today is around outdoor space. So adding some form of pergola or alfresco type entertaining area. And as we move into the warmer months of the year, it's something that people are really focused on. They're looking forward to spending more time outside. And so if you're able to create that space with the right proportions, it can be really, really beneficial. Now, there's different levels to this, and I'm sure we've all seen some of the very extravagant outdoor kitchens that are almost, and living spaces that are almost being constructed. And that's part of it, is if you do it to a certain standard, then it is almost like adding another living zone to your property. And some of them are getting to the point where they're adding not just barbecues, but bar fridges, then there's smokers, pizza ovens, TVs, couches, all these sorts of things. There's sinks, dishwashers. So there's a lot of extra elements that are being added to these outdoor alfresco areas or outdoor kitchen living spaces. Now, that is typically more focused towards a owner-occupier than going to that extravagant level for an investment property. But even if you've got a nice little terrace house that's got a good backyard, that perhaps isn't necessarily user-friendly, to put up a nice pergola that might have a grapevine growing up it, or you could put some laser light over to create an extra living zone, but not necessarily to the same expense, that can certainly add significant value to a property and create a really good outdoor environment, and in a far more cost-effective manner too. So I think that's something that can be looked at in the right property to add good value to a property without going overboard with expenses. If you're going down that more extravagant outdoor kitchen living area type path, well, that is more focused towards, I guess, what you want and what you need. So they're the main sorts of things I think, and I think there's certainly ways and means to be able to add value. When I talk about the cost perhaps being a little bit higher than the value add, that's more in the short term. If you look at these on a more medium to long term basis, they're absolutely going to add value, and probably, but if costs continue to rise, they're going to cost more to do something similar down the track. So the value add is going to be there. And in the long term, the value add will exceed the cost. It's more in an immediate sense that we talk about the cost of what it's been to your budget versus the immediate value add. So certainly something to look at and to consider. It's very much a case-by-case basis. So you need to look at that and think, well, certain properties, like we said, the garage is going to add significant value, but perhaps the granny flat is going to be more of a lifestyle choice for what you need. So it's very much a case-by-case basis. Look at it and understand what the purpose of the construction is, and make sure it meets what your purposes and your requirements are. But that's about it for episode 88 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Thanks again for joining me. Please feel free to share the podcast far and wide. And if you would like further information, please visit our website, wakeland.com.au. Otherwise, we wish you all the best with your property decisions.